Hello everybody, it's 3:30, which means it is time for one of our after-school STEM shows. Got a couple special guests with me, one of whom you can probably hear just off frame there, or maybe on frame, I don't know what I'm looking at. That's Angel the parrot. We'll talk about her in a little bit, assuming she sticks around. But it's 3:30, which means it's time for one of our after-school STEM shows, and so if you've been paying attention, we've been doing these every day for the last several months here. Where basically every day at 3:30 we go live with one of our educators here at the Science Center and we talk about some sort of science-y topic with some of the stuff that we have around the Science Center. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that I don't think we've covered yet. We've done a lot of these at this point, so it's hard to remember. I'm really being a prima donna today. But what we're going to be talking about is something called sexual dimorphism. And that's a big word that is made up of a lot of kind of smaller words, and you can break it down into basically you can break that term down into kind of three separate parts. You can talk dimorphism breaks into two parts. So morph, which is a word I'm sure you've heard. When I say the word morph, what do you think of? And feel free to shout out in the audience what you think of when you hear the word morph.
Like doing different colors, like morphing different colors in animals.
So she said different colors, and that's fair. So a lot of times you'll hear morph as something that is like changing, and like specifically if you're like really breaking it down to the original root language, which I think is Greek for morph, it's a shape. So we hear it a lot of times in the idea of like changing shapes. So like I don't know if people still read these books, but there were the Animorphs books when I was a kid. They were people who could change into animals. They would morph into animals. But ultimately, when you say morph, generally it's changing shape or somehow changing your form. Di means two, so what's a word that starts with di that has a two in it? Like a diode or a dyad has two parts to it, so dimorphism, two shape, two form. And then sexual, which is referring to biological sex, so male-female sexual dichotomy. So it is differences in shape or form determined by biological sex is what we're talking about. And so I have with me a number of different critters or remnants of critters that are members of species that do experience sexual dimorphism, do show sexual dimorphism. We're going to talk a little bit about different types of sexual dimorphism. We're going to talk a little bit about how some of these animals exhibit it and why they maybe exhibit it. And so just because she's being loud and annoying right now, and maybe he's gonna end up going back down into her cave. We'll get her out of the way first. And Angel is a great example. Angel is a blue-fronted Amazon parrot, and Angel is a female blue-fronted Amazon parrot. And this is a great example of how sexual dimorphism is, in a lot of times, determined by what the critter is. And so, for example, Angel and her species, the blue-fronted Amazon parrots, are kind of unique in that they have really, really, really good vision. So humans have pretty good vision, but parrots are on like a whole different level. Most birds are as far as the caliber of vision they have. And one of the things that's very different about blue-fronted Amazon parrots versus a human eye, for example, is humans, we detect three colors. Almost threw up two fingers there. Three colors with our eyes. We can see, all the colors we see are a product of sensing different levels of red, green, and blue. And so if you look really close at your computer or phone screen right now, you might be able to look really close to it and see that the little pixels in your screen are actually showing different levels of red, green, and blue. I don't know if it still works actually with modern screens, but if you look at it like an old TV, if you're looking at that, like an old tube TV or old tube computer screen, if you looked really close to it, you could see it was made up of red, green, and blue nodes. Angel is special. Blue-fronted Amazons are special, and that they actually have a fourth cone. They have a fourth color receptor in their eyes that we don't have. And what that lets them do is see much deeper into the ultraviolet spectrum than what we can. So they see blues and purples and stuff like that much better than we do, and much deeper into that spectrum than we do. And so if you look at a male versus a female blue-fronted Amazon parrot, we can't tell the difference. Like, there's genuinely just nothing physical about her versus a male that we can see with our eyes. But if a male blue-fronted Amazon parrot and a female blue-fronted Amazon parrot were standing in front of Angel, she could absolutely tell the difference because they're different colors to her because her eyes are different. And so like I said, it's an example of how you'll see the dimorphisms show up differently for different animals based on what the needs are. And so for her, like, the color isn't necessarily a product of, like, it's not helping her survive. It's not a naturally selected color. It's what we would call a sexually selected color, which we'll get into a little bit more later. Oh, come on. There we go. And so it needs to be something that is appealing to potential mates, is the long and short of it. So the coloration for the blue-fronted Amazon parrots isn't necessarily about survival. It's about preference for mating, which can ultimately have just as much an effect, or almost as much of an effect as, you know, likelihood to survive, because as we know with evolution, as we mentioned a couple times probably in these talks before, evolution isn't necessarily just about surviving, it's about reproducing. So anything that helps you reproduce is going to make you more likely to pass that on, and those traits are going to start showing up further on in the line. And so, like I said, doesn't help her survive. Her colors are bright and weird and showy, but that's to make mates potentially see her better. You got a question?
Someone said there was a cool video where they showed that small rodents' urine was UV reactive, so birds could extract them.
Yeah, and this is something that we've talked about too. I don't need to explore. It's kind of similar to that. Yeah, you want to take her back down? Notoriously fussy partner in these shows. Oh, come on. But anyways, yeah, when we were talking about the birds being very good at seeing UV light, that's something that's very common among birds. And another place where we'll sometimes talk about this out on the exhibit floors with our blue-tongued skink. There's a lot of models out there that are kind of questioning why blue-tongued skinks have blue tongues and what they use it for. General consensus is like, yeah, it's a defense mechanism somehow, but they're not quite entirely sure like what it is. And then one of the models for it is, if you notice, when she gets stressed out, she'll stick her tongue out, but she'll also look up with it. She'll stick her head right up in the air and stick her tongue out. And so one of the hypotheses for the reason that they have the blue tongue and the reason it works as a defense mechanism is that because birds see so good in the UV spectrum, that tongue is somehow very, like, almost like too bright to look at for a lot of birds, and so they'll not want to be near it. So you basically, you see a predatory bird over you, you like stick your tongue out, basically just like popping a flashbang on them, and they just leave. Not a not a model that is like universally agreed upon by any means, but it's speaking to that same thing where you're talking about how, you know, the insect urine is UV reactive, and how I said Angel and her kind use UV light spectrum to see males from females with them. And so what we talked about a little bit with Angel is how it's not always how sexual dimorphism can be a product of either what we would say natural selection or of sexual selection. And so the difference between that is sexual selection is stuff that is not necessarily associated with survival rate, it's just associated with likelihood of mating. Whereas stuff that we would call natural selection tends to be more associated with survival rate, which in and of itself obviously has implications for how likely you are to mate. You're not going to mate if you don't make it to adulthood. And so another good example, and this is something you'll notice as a trend, is birds do this a lot, where you'll see kind of very specific type of plumage that is different from the males to the females. And what you'll see a lot of times is with birds is the females tend to have much more, call it practical plumage that would help them be camouflaged in the wild, plumage that would help them live a full life. Whereas males tend to have very showy but oftentimes very impractical plumage. So you can see like the green head on our mallard here, or if you've ever seen like a peacock, you know, we sell peacock feathers down in the gift shop, for example. Only the males have the big feathers because they're big and stupid, and why would you ever want those unless it was helping you mate? So the peahens don't have nearly that big of a tail or nearly that bright of a coloration because it just makes you more likely to get eaten. And why do you see this where the females tend to have the practical colors and the males don't? Ultimately, it comes down to sort of the the economics of mating, let's call it, where mating is a much bigger investment for a female animal than it is for a male animal. Females can only become pregnant once at a time, whereas males can impregnate several mates at a time. The whole process of going through a pregnancy is a much bigger investment than what the male has to do just physically with his body. So what you tend to see is females tend to be the picky ones, and the males have to be competitive. And so what you'll see with, like I said, a lot of critters is this comes down to like some sort of bright, vibrant plumage that ultimately, like, the intention is for it to be like a show of health. If my plumage is very big and very bright, it means I have a lot of resources to feed this plumage. It's sort of a show of wealth, so to speak, to have very bright plumage. The other thing you'll see every once in a while is situations where you have males physically fighting one another. So, good example of that. Actually, look at this one. Deer. One right around here that a lot of people know, the white-tailed deer. And you'll notice we have just the skull here, because they're too big for us to just have around the science center. But you'll notice the skull has, obviously, these big antlers on the top of it. And only the male deer have the antlers, and that's because what they use the antlers for is mostly for fighting with other deer. And they do that for territory and for mating, mostly. And so the females don't have them, because they're just a waste of resources, because what are you using them for? You're the one who's getting to be picky about it. So the males have to invest this extra resource into this thing that's going to help them mate, while the females don't really have to, so they don't have it. Other thing that's kind of interesting with sort of that model, where you have males competing for females, is another very common type of sexual dimorphism is size. And this is something you see to varying degrees in almost any critter, where either the males or the females of a given species tend to be bigger. With mammals, it tends to be the males that end up being bigger, because this model is very common. We have one male and a bunch of females, and so the males compete with each other for the group of females. And so the bigger males are more able to fight, and so they tend to get sexually selected for. It's not necessarily a natural selection where you're more likely to survive by being bigger, but it could arguably be true too. But it is something that is sexually selected for because it makes you more likely to reproduce. And so that's very common with mammals. That's a thing that most mammals have, and as a result, pretty much with all mammals, the males are bigger than the females. But it's not quite so true with other things. So we have, for example, our two African clawed frogs here. I don't know how. Maybe you can push the card in a little closer here to get a look at them. And so we have here two African clawed frogs that are relatively close to the same age. We have Ludwig, who is here on my left, and we have Yoshi, who is here on my right. And one thing that you'll notice is true is that Yoshi is quite a bit bigger than Ludwig is. And that is largely a product of sexual dimorphism. Yoshi is female, Ludwig is male. If you come and visit us on the exhibit floor, you might see our boas, Rusty and Artemis, who are similarly pretty close to the same age, and even pretty close to the same length. And so why is that? What's?
We have a chat.
Yeah.
Spiders also have some extreme dimorphism between male and female. Males are tiny. Males are all tiny. Try to sneak into and out of webs to make without getting munched.
Yep. So what the comment there was is that spiders are another good example that has very much a size-based dimorphism with a lot of them. It's not always true for all of them. Like we have tarantulas here, and the size thing doesn't really hold true for them. The males and the females end up being pretty much the same size for most of their lives. But yeah, you're true. That's true. A lot of spiders do exhibit a similar thing with this, more extreme version of this even than what we're seeing here with our two clawed frogs. And so the question is, why is that? We talked about how with things like deer or lions or gorillas, like why the males are bigger, it's because they gotta fight other males and the winner gets the mates, and so they get preferentially selected for. But with these guys, where we have a situation where the females are bigger, what's the benefit of that? And so this tends to be true with a lot of egg-laying things, is the females end up being bigger than the males do. And the big difference between between being an egg layer and being a live birther is that egg layers tend to have a lot more babies at a time. And so bigger females end up getting preferentially selected for because a bigger female can hold more eggs in her, basically. And so when they reproduce, they lay more eggs, and so there's more of their offspring in the next generation, and so they tend to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so even in species where you do see like male-to-male fighting for female reproduction rights, that's a weird way to phrase that, but males fighting for a mate, with a lot of cold-blooded stuff, you will still see the females be bigger than the males are for that reason, because the females are able to produce more young in a given season. One thing that's kind of interesting, though, is, like I said, it's not true necessarily across the board for all reptiles, all amphibians, all fish, all insects where the females are bigger. There are some where the males are bigger, and it, again, similar to the mammals, tends to be ones where you see a lot of like direct competition between males for mating, so like alligators and crocodiles, for example, the males tend to be bigger. The other interesting thing with alligators and crocodiles, though, and this is true for some turtles too, is that they are really, really, really unique in the animal kingdom in that their sex is not determined by genetics. They don't have X and Y chromosomes. Or at conception they don't. And so what happens with them is their sex is determined by the temperature of the nest. And so there is some models that go with this where typically the association is a warmer nest results in more females and a cooler nest results in more males. And that checks out with a lot of the species that this happens for, because when you're a reptile, warmer generally means bigger too. So you increase the temperature of the nest, you start seeing more females. The females get bigger than the males do because they've been exposed to more heat from the time they're laid, basically. This is kind of an interesting little twist on the trend there. Let's see. Coloration with these guys is not a result of dimorphism. This is separate breeding. You can find male or female clawed frogs that are in either color palette we have here. So not the same as the ducks. This is a pet trade result. Dancing, doing like ornate displays, or again, this is very much a bird thing where you, build a weird, particularly ornate nest. It's very similar to the coloration where, like I said, it's kind of a show of wealth to a show of resources, a show of fitness to have stuff that you don't need. It's if you're a peacock and you're able to have this big, huge, bright tail, what you're saying is, I get enough food to support this big, huge, bright tail. If I can get enough food for this thing, you know that I'm genetically great. I'm being successful out here. Mate with me, please.
And bird pyramid is a little dance.
Yeah. As I said, very much a bird thing. Birds are extra when it comes to their whole mating practices thing. It's really interesting. It's not something I'm like deeply familiar with, honestly, like the different bird ones, but there's a ton of different ways they go about it, and it's always fun. Here's another example. We have our cockroaches, and cockroaches are kind of interesting in the insects, is they kind of have a similar thing with the deer, where you'll see the males grow these little bumps on the top of their head, and they'll use that to kind of fight with each other for mates in a similar way that deer do. And you'll see the females don't really have those. But it's similarly kind of an interesting weird thing is that the females tend to get bigger than the males with these. So you've kind of got a combination where you have the males that are kind of preferentially selected for size because of, like I said, needing to fight off other males. But then similarly, you have the females that are being preferentially selected for because big female can carry a big egg sac with her and have a lot of babies. And so you have a situation here where both are being selected for bigness, ultimately, but but the females are outpacing the males generally. Oops.
Didn't really pick up their head bumps.
Yeah, let's see if we can get him nice and close. Let's see, right there. And this guy's probably not the biggest male in the tank, not the most developed yet, but if you go in there and you look at him, you can definitely tell a difference between the males and the females.
He wasn't moving as much as
Ellie helped me out with it today. I literally told her how to tell a difference today, and she did it successfully. She found a male and a female. So, let's see. Any other interesting sexual dimorphism stuff to talk about? We talked about different colors. We talked about different size. Oh, I guess one thing you could talk about is what we would call, I guess, sort of content of the body, I guess. This is true for a lot of critters, and true for a lot of the critters, especially that where the females get a lot bigger, is you tend to also see that females have a much higher relative body fat percentage than males do. And again, that's a product of more body fat facilitates a more successful pregnancy. So you'll see this with like snakes, where the females will be not just bigger and thicker and heavier, but also be relatively fattier. True in humans too. Check body fat percentage, and on the average, females are going to be pretty notably higher than male humans are in that regard. There are potentially also things, and I don't know if this necessarily counts as a dimorphism, because like I said, if you really break the word dimorphism down, it refers to like a physical shape. But there's also potentially something to be spoken about as far as telling the difference between males and females in a given animal is things like scent. So if you think about like a dog, for example, you know, if you look at two black labs that are more than like right next to you, you really can't tell the difference between a male and a female black lab, but the black labs can tell the difference between each other. And so, like I said, they're largely doing it by senses that are not their sight. They're doing it by scent primarily. And so it kind of speaks back to like what Angel has, where she has this really specific type of dimorphism that she exhibits that is a product of the type of animal she is. An animal with really good eyesight, but if you're an animal that has really good smell or really good hearing or really good taste or whatever, the dimorphism might be more in line with that, especially if it's something that is sexually selected for rather than naturally selected for. There was one last thing I was going to talk about. Let's see. Oh, another big perk of having sexual dimorphism size-wise is you'll see this happen sort of on a species-wide level as like a natural selection, where a lot of times will let the species be more successful. You'd have more of a given species within a smaller area, because if say the females of a species are significantly bigger than the males are, then a lot of times you're not competing for the same food. The females will be eating bigger food than the males are, and so if you're not competing for the same food, you can have more of the same critter in the same area. So there's a individual level of preference for sexual dimorphism in a lot of critters for size, but there's also kind of the species-wide one where species that exhibit it tend to be a little bit more successful too, based on competition type of stuff. But anyway, I've been rambling for a while here, so I think we'll start wrapping up here. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for participating in chat. Thank you, Ellie, for running the camera for me and reading my questions. If you want to come and visit us here at the Headwaters Science Center, we are open right now, Friday, Saturday, and Monday from 9:30 to 5:30. We are also open Sunday from 1 to 5:30. We do these shows every day at 3:30, so if you happen to come by during one of these shows, you might be able to come by and be in the audience. Didn't have anybody here today, but I do enjoy having you guys, and maybe you'd get a chance to participate or ask a question in person, and that'd be pretty fun, I think. I like having an audience here. It makes it a lot easier for me to bounce questions off of people that way. But anyways, you can follow us on any of the socials. This is a live stream that goes out on YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook. So if you're watching us on any of those, you can go and follow us on any of those and we'll appreciate that. Or if you're watching the video on demand of this later, so this goes up on our YouTube as a video later as well. So if you're seeing that, again, go follow us on any of those socials. Go right ahead. Anyway, thank you for watching, and tomorrow is going to be probably James doing I don't know. So tune in.